All right, perfect. Today we are looking at economic integration, which has got to do with customs unions and free trade areas. So, what I'm mostly going to be doing though here is an analysis of two special graphs over and beyond just the definitions of what some of these things are. All right.
Okay.
Let's just cut to the chase here. All right. So, economic integration. So, this is basically just in general here as well as the customs union. And then we also talk of what a free preferential trade arrangement is, which is quite straightforward because even the name gives a description of what this is about, right? So it basically provides lower barriers for countries or on trade among participating nations or countries than on other non-member nations. So this basically falls under a broad topic where we are dealing with barriers to trade, right, which are deliberate barriers to trade that are put up by certain countries for one or more reasons. And one example of which you could implement a barrier in trade maybe is to put up tariffs, put up embargoes, etc. So it's basically under trade restrictions is what we are dealing with. And then now we are dealing with situations now. The first situation that we want to deal with is that of where there's a preferential trade arrangement. So that basically is when there are barriers in general, like what most countries have. But then the barriers are deliberately lowered for certain countries and then they're deliberately left high for certain countries. So whenever there's a preferential trade arrangement, it's part of economic integration. So there is agreements between certain countries, right? And then when there is agreements and arrangements between certain countries which basically lower such trade restrictions between the countries, then it becomes a preferential trade arrangement, right? So this example here that's given for the preferential trade agreement for the British Commonwealth. So these Commonwealth countries were countries that were previously colonized by the British, right? They were previously colonized by. So after attaining their independence, they were part of the Commonwealth. So which means there was a preferential trade arrangement between the countries that were in the Commonwealth, right? And then other than that, we would have, of course, a free trade area, right, which is what we would ideally hope for, right? So this is a form of integration. Sorry, I'm being interrupted here. I think there's some call. I need to just cancel it out quickly.
Okay.
My network actually gets disturbed. Okay. My network gets disturbed when there's a call. All right, it's fine. I'm gonna attend to it much later.
Okay. Also, the sound is a bit like it's a bit shaky because then I hear you and then I don't hear you, but then I hear you, but then you're faint. Um,
All right, okay. I'm just hoping it's gonna improve now. Maybe the phone call was interrupting.
all
All
right.
right. All right. Okay, let's continue.
Okay.
So when you have a free trade area, so this is a form of economic integration wherein all barriers are removed on trade among nations, but each nation retains its own barriers to trade with non-members. So now there is a nexus now between the preferential trade arrangement and free trade area. You realize that with the preferential trade, difference between these two now is the preferential trade arrangement, you provide lower barriers of trade among participating nations. So you still do have barrier to trade. So you've got maybe, say, you still do have a tariff, right? You still do have tariffs, but the tariffs are like slightly lower than for the other nations or for the other countries, which are non-member countries. So non-member nations will have higher barriers than member nations. But when it comes to a free trade area, what they have in common again is there is a preferential treatment opposed to member nations. And then the big difference there is that for the free trade area, all barriers are totally removed. So it's basically a free trade region. So maybe let's say we could have that for regions that are in the South Africa. We could have a free trade area where goods basically move really between the countries. But when it comes to countries that are outside of the region, then that would specifically not apply. So that's what you get there for a free trade. All right, and then a customs union allows no tariff or other barriers on trade members, as in a free trade area, and in addition, it harmonizes trade policies. So a customs union is just the same as a free trade area, except that in addition to that, we have to harmonize trade policies, right? And then a common market goes beyond the customs union by allowing free trade movement of labor and capital among nations. So the EU achieved the status of a common market beginning of 1993. I actually do have a friend that's in Europe. So this guy was telling me all about this.
Oh, that sounds cool.
It is actually helpful for countries that participate in that, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
And
for
then
sure.
an economic union goes still further by harmonizing or even unifying the monetary and the fiscal policies of the member states. Right. So this is the most advanced type of economic integration. So that would also be cool. All right, so I haven't quite heard of this, but the examples, this is the example here. Benelux, which is an economic union between Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Yeah, so this was formed after World War II and is now part of EU, okay? Why I don't know about it. All right, and then, okay, that one we can skip. Let's look at trade creating customs union, and then we also look at trade diverting customs union. So the static partial equilibrium effects of forming a customs union are measured in terms of trade creation and trade diversion. All right. Let's see if we can succeed in skipping. Okay, let's not skip that. All right. A trade creation occurs when some domestic production in a nation that is a member of a customs union is replaced by a lower cost imports from another member nation. So let's say we have a customs union in South Africa. Right? Then in this customs union, let's just say SADC in this instance, let's just put in 3 countries. Let's say we have South Africa, and then we have let's just say we have South Africa, and then we have Lesotho, and then we also have Swaziland. Like let's just say we have formed a customs union between those countries, those 3 countries. And then we are initially trading with Lesotho, right? Let's say we are buying diamonds from Lesotho and they are costing us $15. So a trade creation occurs now when we divert our trade from Lesotho to Swaziland, and Swaziland is offering $10 while Lesotho is offering $15. So that becomes a trade creation. Trade creation is always positive, always works for the good of the participating country because we are replacing a higher cost with a lower cost import. So that is very good in terms of the welfare of the member nation. So assuming that all economic resources are fully employed before and after the formation of the customs union, this increases the welfare of member nations because it leads to greater specialization in production based on comparative advantage. So comparative advantage, we spoke about little bit earlier, a few classes ago, and we're saying in order for trade to be beneficial, obviously, looking at our assumption of two countries, then if we're going to be looking at it in terms of the theory of comparative advantage, then we are saying a country has to specialize on the commodity which it produces at a lower opportunity cost. Right? So which means when this occurs now, because in this kind of customs union, the lower cost imports are going to replace the higher cost imports. So which means there's going to be specialization. So if you are able to produce something at a lower cost, then in these circumstances, you will have to specialize on that. We give you the opportunity to specialize on that which you are good at, right? That in which you have a comparative advantage, and then you can trade for the other one. So a trade creating customs union also increases the welfare of non-members, because some of the increase in real income due to its greater specialization in production spills over into increased imports from the rest of the world. So this is the theory that if there's an economic boom, say in Dubai, all the other countries in the Emirates region are going to benefit from that, or any other country that basically trades with that country is bound to benefit from that then. So this is what that's all about. Right, so let's look at illustration here on the graph. Right, let's basically look at the illustration there on the graph. Right, so we are looking at this trade creation here. Right, we are looking at this trade creation here. So obviously our starting point there, we have our demand and our supply as given there in those graphs. And by the way, we should train ourselves, but these ones are very simple because these graphs are straight lines, so they must be simpler to draw. Right, so there's not a big problem with that. All right, so DX, so it represents domestic demand and domestic supply, DX and SX there. And then at the tariff, that tariff there, so at the tariff inclusive price, which is $2 before the formation of the customs union, nation 2 basically consumes 50, right? There you go, it consumes that 50 there, right, which is that demand, and then 20 is produced right there, so at that price, right? And then what is being imported, what's being imported now is the difference between there and there, right? That's basically what is being imported there, which is 50 minus 20, so that's the 30 there, 30 tons, I assume, that's being imported. So nation 2 also collects a revenue of what? Of 30. So how do they get that revenue? So it's difference there between 2 and 1, and then you're multiplying that by 30. So that's the revenue that is being collected. So 30 is what is being imported, right? And then the tariff that is charged on the import. So the import there is going to be given as, so it's between 1 and 2. So the initial price is 1, and then with the tariff, price gets to 2. So the difference basically gives you the tariff there. So you multiply tariff by the units that are imported to give you the revenue that the government is gaining. And we'll like to assume that the revenue that the government works, assuming that there is no corruption, is basically used to improve the welfare of the country. Right. The nation 2 does not import commodity X from 3, right? Because of the tariff inclusive, which is greater than 2 there. Then after nation 2 forms a customs union with nation 1, and then nation 2 basically consumes what? Basically consumes 70 right there. And then there's production at 10, and then so they've basically removed that tariff now, right? And then I'm going to explain that again. Then tariff revenue disappears, and the area represents the transfer from domestic producers to the domestic consumers. This leaves a net state gains as the whole that is equal to 15, given by the sum of the shaded triangles there. So let me just explain this graph without reading this whole stuff here. Right, so the starting point here in this graph, you've got your supply and your demand. So point E there would be representative of your autarky prices, which is the local price, or which is the domestic price, right? Which is where your S and your D, your demand and your supply intersect. Right? But the price is high if you compare that price with the global market. So the global market basically represents any of these prices, particularly the lowest price there would be the global market, right? The global market price, which is the free trade price. So initially, this is our free trade price. Now, because we don't have any arrangement with Nation One, so which means, and Nation One is the best producer, right? So in other words, Nation One have the lowest price in the market. So in other words, they have a comparative advantage in the production of the said commodity, or the particular commodity that we'll be dealing with. Let's say it's commodity X. So which is why we are only going to put the price there for Nation One. So these ones here represent Nation One. So initially, this is the price, the global price, of which Nation One is the supplier. Nation One is the cheapest supplier in the market. So because we don't have any arrangement with Nation One, we naturally impose, say, 100% tariff on all the commodities that are coming into the country. So which means though Nation One can supply us at 1 rand, because of the tariff it gets to us at 2 rand, right? And then once we've imposed a tariff on this 1 rand, so the price goes up to 2 rand. So this is our initial starting point now, before we have a customs union. So which means that that price now, what are we importing? We demand 50, and then we are locally producing 20. So we are importing the difference there, which is that 30 that was being spoken about, right? And then the government revenue is going to be 30, which is the units of X that we are importing into the country, times the tariff per unit. So the tariff per unit is the difference between the new price and the old price, which is 1 rand. So 1 times 30 will give you the government revenue in terms of tariffs, that for every unit that comes in, for every unit of X that comes into the country. So that's what you get. So that's basically going to be represented by that box there. Right? That's the area given there by that box. All right. And then once we have, since we're discussing a trade creating customs union, now that we have a trade creating customs union, of which we said this by definition now is when a country is being shifted into a country that is still within the customs union, and it's a low cost import, right? So of which the lowest cost import here is Nation One. So say we have gone into an arrangement now that includes Nation One in our customs union, then necessarily we are going to withdraw this tariff, right? Because we are now in a customs union which includes Nation One. So once we've withdrawn this tariff, now it means the price is going to go back down to 1 there, right? The price basically drops back to 1. So the advantage that we gain now from that is our demand is going to shift up to 70, right? Because of the lower price, then our production is going to go down. Of course, the production is going to go down from 20 up until 10. But what is happening here now is producer surplus is going down, right? Producer surplus is going down, but at the end of the day, it's going down at the expense of consumer surplus. So what was lost by what is being lost by the producers is basically being gained again by the consumers, right? So which means in total, the welfare gain is going to be represented by that triangle and that triangle there. That will basically represent the increase in welfare. All right. So let's jump now and have a look at a trade diverting customs union. Right. First of all, what is a trade diversion? So a trade diversion would be the opposite of a trade creation. So when we talk of a trade diversion now, we are dealing with a situation when low-cost imports from outside of the union are being replaced by high-cost imports from a union member. So just because, let's say now we have got a customs union in the SADC here, right? So which means we are basically giving preferential trades to countries that are within the SADC. Right? Suppose now we could have gotten commodity X from a country that is outside SADC because they are producing it cheaper than us. But because of this customs union that we've gotten into, we are bound by certain arrangements now where we have to consume now at a higher cost as a result of the arrangement that we've had, right? So this results because of preferential trade treatments given to member nations. So we spoke about preferential trade. So preferential trade, we said earlier, this would be a situation where, for instance, the barriers that have been put across the SADC region are quite lower than the barriers of other countries in general, right? Than other countries in general, which will end up forcing us to consume from countries that are within the region. So it's still part of a preferential trade treatment. And then it's a case now where the low-cost imports from outside of the region are being replaced by high-cost imports from within this region. Right. Trade diversion by itself reduces welfare because it shifts production from a more efficient producer who is outside of the customs union to a less efficient producer from inside the union. Right. So trade diverting customs union results in both trade creation and trade diversion. Right. And therefore can increase or reduce the welfare of union members depending on the relative strength of the two opposing forces. So let's look at an example here. All right, let's look at an example here. All right, so if you recall from the first example, so we are picking it up again from the first graph that we're dealing with, and now we are saying nation one again is still, we are nation two here in this diagram. So we are saying nation one is the best producer, right? And hence they are producing this at a lower price. Right? They're basically producing this at the lowest price, so which is given as the world trade price, right? Or the free trade price. So that price is still given there as one. Okay. So when we enter now into, okay, before we get there, so we have nation one producing and selling at a price of 1, and then we have nation 3 producing and selling this at a price of 1.5, right? So which means naturally we would want to go for which price? We want to go for the prices of nation one, which is cheaper, right? Nation one is cheaper. So in the global market, you want to go for the cheapest. So if we put a tariff, say 100% tariff like we did there, then it basically means that it gets to our country at a price of 2. And then the same that applies, what applies on the first diagram would apply on the second diagram, whereby at a price of 2, we have our demand at 50 and our production at 20, and then we are basically importing the difference there. But when we enter into a 20% tariff that we are imposing on every other commodity, but let's say nation 3 is part of our customs union, so which means nation 3 is not going to be affected by the 100% tariff that would have imposed on other nations. So which means whenever we import from nation 1, it gets to us at a price of 2. But when we import from nation 3, it gets to us at a price of 1.5, right? At 150, because there's no tariff that is put on there. So which means now you will notice that as a result of our trade policy, and the price effects thereof, we are basically now diverting trade from nation one, whereas nation one is able to produce this thing cheaper, to nation three, right, who's producing this slightly expensive as a result of our trade policy that pushes this price from 1 to 2 there. So that's the trade diversion there that we are talking about. All right, so the welfare gain in nation 2 from pure trade creation is given by the sum of the two triangles. So this is just the same as what happens there. Right? How is it a gain? Because we are dropping from a price of 2 to a price of 1.5. But the welfare loss now is this one here, which is this shaded triangle here. So this shaded rectangle, this would show us the welfare loss. Right? How so? This is what we could have been importing. Right? This is basically what we could have been importing cheaper. But unfortunately, we have to go higher and import it at 50 cents higher, right? So from there to there, it represents the extra price, right, that we are going to be paying there for each and every one of these imports. So in other words, this is what would have been gained had it been a trade creation, right? But now it becomes, because it's a trade diversion, then that's what we are losing potentially. So as they were saying now, these are the gains of trade creation, right? These two here, because we've just created trade from nation one, by diverting trade from nation one to nation three. So we are also creating trade with nation three. But as a result of the diversion now, this is what we are losing there, right? So it's in your best interest to be able to draw this diagram, right? It's in your best interest to be able to draw this diagram. And then I think what's going to be important for examination purposes is not the calculations per se in terms of giving out numbers there, but what's important is showing these in terms of the shaded regions. So whether this ends up being a welfare gain or a welfare loss depends on, in terms of netting, it basically depends on how big these triangles are there compared to this rectangle, right? I don't know if you guys have any questions tonight. Any questions? Any questions? Any questions?